Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach to everyone who's with us today. I see many, but not all of you. I'm very grateful to you for being here. And I hope that in the next 45 to 55 minutes, we can share some meaningful learning and take some meaningful action to get a perspective on Rosh Hashanah as the day of memory. Some of you have been with me for 2 previous sessions that I've taught earlier this month about Rosh Hashanah as a day of memory. And just to sort of summarize a little for those of you who were here and those of you who were not, one of the original rabbinic names for Rosh Hashanah is Yom HaZikaron, the day of memory. And I want us to really deeply explore what that means for us, both in terms of our own individual memories and about our collective memory as a people. It's also, known as Yom Hadin, the day of judgment. For our purposes today, I really want to think about the task, the discipline, and the collective responsibility of memory. For this, I'm going to ask you to engage in a writing exercise of a few moments. And I want to ask you, and if you need to run off for a moment, that's fine, to either get something to write with or have something open on your screens if you're willing to use them in that way to write something down. And we'll get to that later. So I'm going to talk for a little bit. And I know it's a long day of talking, and I want to thank you in advance for your patience, for looking at Zoom and listening to people talk. Then we're going to look at some texts together. And toward the end, we're going to do a little writing exercise. And so I hope and want very much that this writing exercise will be meaningful to you and useful to you throughout 5781. It's something that I'm going to want you to hold on to and refer back to throughout the year, because today is the day of memory. Rabbi Adina Allen says, today is the day when everything must go. The attic of our habits and our dispositions and our actions get thrown out, and we start all over again. This is an active, physical, embodied, and forward-looking activity. Those are things that memory actually is. We think of memory as with respect to our history, for example, never forgetting the Holocaust. We think of it with respect to, remembering people's birthdays and remembering what that thing we forgot to write on the grocery list. But as I talked about in the first session, memory actually is deeply involved in not only calling to mind, but repeating, not just words or ideas, but actions. Repeating them so that repeating them transforms and elevates them. So what we write down today is something that you are going to repeatedly come back to and repeat, I hope, during the year. And as a result, you will transform the action that you're going to write down so that by the end of the year, you can look back on what you started to do this day as a way of committing to and reenacting a memory. So that's going to be sort of our homework. So just to recap briefly, in the first session, we talked about how humans remember. What is memory anyway? And what do we do? And as I mentioned, it means many things. It means to recall, recreate, repeat, bring to mind, but it also means to do stuff. Specifically, in Jewish tradition, one of the things we do is we commemorate things. Commemoration means observing by repeating, by doing a repetition of an act. And Rosh Hashanah, in a way, is a commemoration. What does it commemorate? There's a prayer that we'll look at toward the end of today's session that it commemorates the birthday of the world. Today, Hayom Harat Olam, today is the day of the birth of the world. It is the advent of creation, and therefore it is the time when we start the cycle of our being all over again. In the second session, we talked a little bit about what does it mean to say that God remembers? How can an omniscient, omnipresent being be said to remember? Because in our terms, to say that God remembers would suggest that God forgets. And if God forgets, what does that say about omniscience and omnipresence? what we talked about is that we help God remember. Part of our job in remembering is to model for God the behavior of bringing something to mind. Starting today and going through Yom Kippur, our acts of prayer and penitence are designed to model human behavior for God, the best of human behavior, and ask God to model that behavior. Just as we elevate ourselves, put forward our good deeds, beg for forgiveness for where we've fallen short, and do a sort of ethical inventory, judging ourselves hopefully mercifully, we ask God to mimic that behavior. Because after all, what other model does God have? The historian of Jewish text, David Stern, says, God has to look to humanity to remember because he has no other model. So we're showing God what and how to bring to mind so that our relationship can be renewed. Now, I'm going to talk today, just so you know, both theologically and sociologically. You may not believe in God, you may not even want to hear about God, and that's fine. But our texts ask for interpretation over and over again. So speaking about God, I will talk about our relationship to the source of all being. And when I talk sociologically, when I put on sort of a sociological anthropological hat, which I encourage you also to do, I'll be talking about how we build community. So in the act of talking about God, one of the things we're doing is building community. So for those of you who don't believe in or have trouble with or can't get over or around the idea of God, think about the fact that you are not only building yourself today, constructing yourself, you're reweaving yourself into community. That's part of what we're doing today. So I also want to say that, and emphasize again, that today we'll be talking about how human and divine memory come together today. We talked in the first session about what the human organism does when it remembers. I'm going to talk a little bit about brain structure today, too, I hope. Second session, we talked about God remembering. Today is the day that is set aside for us to recalibrate our memories with God's memories, to show God what we want remembered and how we want it remembered. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen and have us look at some texts. I'm going to stop after a while of doing text. By the way, please feel free to talk about the text and your reactions to them in the chat. I will try to periodically check in and see what you're saying and respond to it if you'd like. Toward the end, we're going to do this writing exercise, and I will stop sharing the sheet. But for the next little while, I'm going to share the study sheet that I think Taylor also put a link to in the chat, if you'd rather look at it that way. So, of course, there's a whole tractate of the Talmud that's about Rosh Hashanah, and it spends a lot of time thinking about memory, which is interesting. And I highlighted here the words that just this one little paragraph uses for memory. You may remember, if you were with us in the first session, we talked about the two different trilateral Hebrew roots that have to do with memory, which are, as you can see at the end of the first line, the end in Hebrew being on the far left, pikidah, that's formed from one of the roots for memory. And in the second line, the two words highlighted that look identical toward the right side, zechira, zechira, that's formed from the other and more common root from memory. And we'll see in the translation how these words are used differently. So it says, it was taught in the Baraita on Rosh Hashanah, Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah were visited by God and conceived children, which I'm going to stop right there and say that's pretty interesting. Today is not only the birthday of the world, it's the day of significant births that changed the world. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? Rabbi Elazar said this is derived by means of a verbal analogy between one instance of the term revisiting, pekidah, So that form of memory, as we noted in the first session, has frankly a sexual connotation. When God revisits women, he helps them get pregnant. And another instance of the term revisiting by means of a verbal analogy between one instance of the term remembering and another instance of the word remembering, zechirah. It's written about Rachel, and God remembered Rachel. And it is written about Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. A little further down, and the meaning of these instances of the term remembering is derived from another instance of the term remembering with regard to Rosh Hashanah, as it is written, a solemn rest, a memorial, zikaron, again the word memory, proclaimed with the blast of a shofar. Okay, so here the rabbis are struggling and puzzling over the issue of what does it mean when God remembers. One of the main things it means is that God helps barren women get pregnant. Hannah prays ardently to God, and in so doing, in the Haftorah portion that we read today, she helps create the very nature of Jewish prayer. And Rachel, in her pregnancy, helps create one of the patriarchs, right? So Jacob and his brother Esau. So the word zechirah has to do with pregnancy, fecundity. We'll come back to that when we come to the idea of the birthday of the world. Here's what are being stitched together for us. Fertility, bringing someone to mind, and creation itself. So memory is a fundamentally creative aspect. And Rabbi Adina Allen, who I mentioned earlier, says, when you remember, you create. It is as if in painting, when you have to scrape away layers so that you can either redo them or let what's underneath come up. Or for writers, it's like when you redraft and go back to earlier revisions to see what you were doing. For potters, it is like salvaging a work that you might have dented and remembering what you were trying to do when you put that clay on the wheel. All these things are active, and they're embodied, and they're forward thinking. And that is what memory is doing. In Numbers 10:10, God tells us how to remember her. And on your joyous occasions, your fixed festivals, and your new moon days, you shall sound the trumpets over your burnt offerings and your sacrifices of well-being. They shall be a reminder of you before your God. I, the Lord, am your God. So yihiyu lachem zikaron lifnei Elohechem. So God is saying, here's how you remind me to remember you. I need sticky notes. This will serve as a sticky note for me. Taylor, maybe you can help me here and identify somebody else who can read so that the sound of my voice doesn't put people to sleep. Right now, so far, we've stitched together ideas of what memory is. Now I want to talk a little bit about what the Machzor, the High Holiday Prayer Book, does that is absolutely unique. It has inserted within it prayers about Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. That is kingship, memory, and the shofar. So these prayers are inserted into the Rosh Hashanah Musaf service. Usually we have 18 or 19 blessings in the Amidah service. Today there are 9. And in the middle 3, we have blessings to talk about God's kingship, to talk about memory, and to say specific blessings around the act of blowing the shofar. So it's really interesting that right in the middle of that middle portion, inserted into the middle of these new blessings, is the idea of memory. And Taylor, if you could help me identify somebody who would read this blessing that's on the screen right now under Machzor Rosh Hashanah Ashkenaz that starts "You Remember." And if you want to identify yourself to Taylor as somebody who's willing to read, you can raise your hand like this, or you can use the raise hand function. Anybody?
You remember the dealings of humanity in today's world, and you also consider the behavior of all those who lived in earlier times. In your presence are revealed all hidden things and the multitude of secrets from the beginning of creation. For there is no forgetfulness before the throne of your glory, and there is nothing hidden from your eyes.
Thank you very much, Sanford. So here, this is the Hebrew text up above. You can see that both zocher and poked are used. So the first one is you remember the dealings of humanity. And the second one is, and you also consider the behavior of all those who lived in earlier times. So poked means to consider or revisit. And what this little prayer is suggesting is that we are reminding God, a very complicated, interesting theological idea. We're reminding God that God doesn't forget. We're saying that there's nothing hidden from God's eyes, but that it is possible that there are things that slip God's mind. Now, this is a complicated idea, and it's an idea that's, very, if you'll pardon the expression, pregnant on a day like today. The important part of the idea that I want you to think about for your own life, just for a moment right now, and we'll come back to it later, is can you do this with your own life? Everything that we ask God to do in traditional prayer are things that we are being subliminally encouraged to do for ourselves with respect to our own lives. So in other words, what is in your memory that you haven't considered? Because today is the birthday of a reorientation toward your memory. What would you like to create a new memory around? What is something that needs to be brought before your presence? What is something you need to reconsider today? Because today is the day to do it. When we say today is the day of remembering, we mean that we remember God, God remembers us, and we recalibrate our own memory. Here's another one that uses the same two different words for memory, for consideration and remembrance. Can I get another volunteer so you don't only hear my voice? Thank you again, Sanford. And somebody who, even if you've been with us the previous days, somebody that we haven't heard from yet. Don't be shy. Marcy.
Unmute.
Now I hear you.
Okay. Who is not considered on this day? For the remembrance of all that is formed comes before you, the dealings of man and the decree of his fate, the misdeeds of man's actions, the thoughts of man and his schemes, and the motives for the deeds of man.
Thank you. Such good readings today. Wow. Thank you. So it's probably a rhetorical question. Who is not considered on this day? And we remind through prayer in community that remembrance of all that is formed comes before God. The dealings of humanity and the decree of fate and our actions and the thoughts of each of us and our schemes. Now, if all of this is said to come before God, that means that we're putting it out there. For the purposes of the times that we're living in, I think it's very important for each of us, more important maybe than in many of our lifetimes, for each of us to think about what we're putting out there and to orient ourselves toward the beseechings that we do toward God and think about them as applied to ourselves, not at all to suggest that we are God, but that in our construction of the images of God, we may be distancing ourselves from the power of this day. And one of the powers of this day is the opportunity to begin a period of self-inventorying so that we become newly conscious of what we are putting out there, so that all our deeds come before us. And in just the same way that we ask God to judge us with mercy, that's exactly how we should be with ourselves. It doesn't mean excuse making, and it doesn't mean saying that everything that we have done or thought is okay. It means judging ourselves mercifully by letting ourselves see all aspects of our own persona and how we treat it. One thing that's always occurred to me is that when in the very early stages of the book of Genesis, which we'll read soon, when God parades all the animals by Adam and he names them, one of the things that happening is that the human being is naming all the different aspects of what that animal reflects about being in the world. In a sense, it is the human being naming all aspects of their own creatureliness. That's what we can begin to do today. It's a massive, it sounds like a massive and undoable task, but it's an urgent task. It's an important task, never more so, sorry, I'm collapsing, staying. Never more so than now, when we no longer feel as if we're in control of our own being. I want to just pause here and invite you to make comments into the chat about anything that's been said so far. Ginger, I see you volunteered to read, and hopefully you will read again sooner. Are there any questions or comments about anything I've said so far? I can't guarantee I'll get to any of them, but I want you to feel free to talk to me for a moment. Questions, comments, complaints. Complaints should be directed to Taylor. He is the complaint department. I'd like to always pin that on the tech people. Thank you, Taylor. Really appreciate it. So Bob, Robert Cohen, who I know is Bob because he lives upstairs from me, full disclosure, and is a good friend of mine. Bob asks, how can I force myself to remember what I've already forgotten? This is a great question. So here we have to consider what forgetting is. And when we say that there is no forgetting before God, one of the things that we're saying is that things can be occluded or overlooked or not called up when we do our full inventory. One cannot force oneself to remember, but one can do a full inventory. And in the process of doing a full inventory, one may remember or be confronted with things that one didn't expect. One cannot remember everything, but one can do a fearless inventory of one's own motivations, actions, and dispositions. That's all anybody can ask. Abby says, I find it interesting that we translate Hebrew into English and assume that the English word is really what's meant in Hebrew. You're absolutely right, Abby. This is a vexing problem. One of the problems we have is that Hebrew is a very different language and very nuanced, and there are more than one word for memory. One of the things I talked about in the beginning, in the first session, was all the different things that memory can mean. And you know, the word memory has ancient roots which really mean to become newly mindful of. But also when you think about remembering, it means reconstructing. You remember something. Of course, and as I said in the first session, we think about memory as a task of purely recall and of data storage. In Hebrew and in other languages like German, memory is a much more nuanced word, means calling to mind not only data, but sense impressions, feelings, relationships in a way that is much more nuanced than data. Sanford asks, I'm intrigued by your connecting remembering and commemorating. So commemoration means really, when you break down the word, the activity of getting together in community to memorialize something. It's commemorating. And the important thing about this is that what we have done every year of our history until this year is gather physically in community to commemorate the birthday of the world. This year, we're doing it Brady Bunch style in a bunch of grids on our computers because it's the only choice that we have. We will remember this for sure. And it is very possible that we will commemorate it in community in future years. It's a very, very important task. And commemoration is the act of communal remembering. And collective memory is as critical in Judaism as individual memory, if not more so. Bob Cohn points out that Aryeh Bernstein translates Hayom Harat Olam as today is pregnant with eternity. That's very beautiful. And I hope I will talk in a few minutes, excuse me, about how the sages had a little problem with the idea of the birth of the world, because it suggested that the divinity was entirely feminine and gave birth to the world. Too bad for them. That's an image that works. And Aryeh Bernstein beautifully captures that each moment, and especially today, is pregnant with eternity, because olam not only means world, but it is from the root that means a couple of different things. One is the world, one is eternity, and a third thing that root of that word olam means is what is hidden. It's fascinating that the world we live in has a very hidden aspect that has always been there and will always be there. And one of the things we're doing today is getting back in touch with that. I really appreciate your excellent comments, and I'm going to go back to the texts now because I see time is flying by. I'm going to skip the binding of Isaac for now, and I'm going to talk about a later period in Isaac's life. Tomorrow we're going to read about the binding of Isaac, which is something that my dissertation research was on. I've thought a lot about, but perhaps a little unusually, today I want to think about the later period of Isaac's life, when he has a little more agency, when he has survived being placed on the altar by Abraham and walking right up to the edge of non-existence. Isaac becomes a very successful agriculturalist and a peacemaker. And the later part of his life is talked about in this section of Genesis. And Ginger, if you would like to read, please be my guest. There are a couple of things that may be hard to pronounce here, but give it your best shot. If you need help, I'll be happy to help you.
Thank you. I'm here.
Great.
So Isaac departed from there and encamped in the Wadi of Gerar, where he settled. Isaac dug anew the wells which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, and which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham's death. And he gave them the same names that his father had given them.
Just pause there for a second. So already we learned that Isaac is repeating his father's patterns. He's going to the same places his father lived, redigging the wells, which is a very pregnant image in all senses of the word about the work that Isaac is doing. And he's unblocking occluded flows. And he's doing it in the same place that his father is doing it, and he has opposition to doing it. Go ahead, Ginger.
But when Isaac's servants digging in the wadi found there a well of spring water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water is ours."
So in other words, Isaac has redug old wells, which the Philistines stopped up because they knew where they were and they didn't want Abraham's people coming around. Water is a precious resource. Now Isaac finds a new well. The minute he finds a new well, the herdsmen say, hey, wait a minute. That's all. Carry on, Ginger.
He named that well Esek, contention, because they contended with him. And when they dug another well, they disputed over that one also. So he named it Sitna, harassment. He moved from there and dug yet another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called it Rehoboth, saying, my screen, I'm on a cell phone, so I can't see the rest of it.
Saying, now at last the Lord has granted us ample space to increase in the land. So Rehoboth means expansiveness or expansion. Here's the pattern I want you to think about in terms of Isaac's later life. The pattern, the essential archetypal pattern that he goes through, is one of contention, harassment, and then expansiveness. The process of digging wells, of self-exploration. In this process, you may be faced by yourself with contention. Different aspects of your personality may bother and harass you and try to distract you from the task. And in the final analysis, when you begin to dig a new well, you will find expansiveness. So the work I'm suggesting that Isaac's life suggests to us through this passage, through his mature life as a farmer and an agriculturalist and a peacemaker, is to do the work of digging and exploration to the point where all the different aspects of your personality work in holistic union and stop fighting you. This is something that this day makes newly present. Here we have a long passage from Rosh Hashanah in the Mishnah. Don't be scared in the Talmud. I'm not going to make us read the whole thing. Now we're going to talk about what God says about these verses of Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. All of this has to do with memory, of the work of memory. All of it applies on a cosmic basis, on a basis of the collective people, and on a personal basis. That's what makes it so miraculous, is it works, tries to work, suggests that we work on all three bases simultaneously. So now we're going to talk about the shofar and how these verses transition from thinking about kingship, remembrance, to the shofar, and what the shofar is meant to do. Now, today we don't blow the shofar. Why? Because it's also Shabbat, and the shofar is not blown on Shabbat. Interestingly, according to the rabbis, it's not because blowing the shofar is work. It's because in order to blow it, you might have to carry it outside of the bounds of where carrying is permitted. So we don't blow the shofar on Shabbat. But we can sure talk about it and study about it. Does anybody want to read this highlighted portion? You can just like click in here and I'll see your name. Anybody? Any takers? Then I'll read it. And recite before me on Rosh Hashanah verses that mention kingships, remembrances, and shofarot. Kingships, so that you will crown me as king over you. Remembrances, so that your remembrance will rise before me for good. And with what will the remembrance rise? It will rise with the shofar. Now let's just think about this first part for a minute. God is telling us to recite verses that we wrote, we meaning humanity. He is telling us to write verses that the rabbis knew had already been written, essentially, so that we can get God, God's self, to do things. Remarkable. We have the power to affect God. That's what this day is about. Theologically speaking, we have the power to move God. Sociologically speaking, it only works when we do something both in community and with deep individual work. That's the unique power of this period that we're entering upon. We can move the world, and it starts within. It also starts up above, and the two can meet in the middle. Carrying on. Similarly, Rabbi Abahu said, why does one sound a blast with a shofar made from a ram's horn on Rosh Hashanah? The Holy One, blessed be he, said, sound a blast before me with a shofar made from a ram's horn, so that I will remember for you the binding of Isaac, son of Abraham, in whose stead a ram was sacrificed. And I will ascribe it to you as if you had bound yourself before me. This is a radical, amazing idea that we are throwing ourselves on God's altar, putting ourselves in the position of Isaac so that God can be in the position of Abraham. That's what judgment is, right? Is taking aspects of ourselves and laying them out and making them completely vulnerable. This is where these radical ideas leave. And I think I had this reading in a previous week. It's from a late rabbinic midrash, Vasikta Rabbati, and rabbinic midrash is very creative, imaginative, and interpretive retellings or explorations of biblical text. This is what the rabbis had God say about Rosh Hashanah. When you appear before me for trial on Rosh Hashanah, come with the shofar. Then, even if there are many accusers against you, I shall recall Isaac's Akedah and acquit you. Wow. So this is saying just bring the horn and, you know, all the people who are arrayed against you, or all the aspects of yourself that are arrayed against yourself, will be literally blown away. Now, what is it like with a shofar? A person blows into one end and the sound comes out the other. So too with your children. And even if there are many accusations against them, I let the accusations go in one ear and out the other. God literally can be reminded to forget. The shofar calls us to action, and it calls God toward what can be remembered and what can be forgotten. God can be asked to forget. In asking for forgiveness, we are asking for a kind of forgetting. We're asking it not only of God, but through the idea of God. We are asking it of our community, and we should, I hope, be asking of it of ourselves. Here's the most radical idea that I love most of all, from an even later book of rabbinic midrash, Sifrei Devarim. God quotes the book of Isaiah. And you are my witnesses, says the Lord, and I am God. When you are my witnesses, I am God. And if you are not my witnesses, I am not God. Just think about that for a minute. What that suggests, it can suggest a couple of different things. I will just pose a couple. One is that God is a social construction, that we only make divinity arise in the world by acting in community in a God-like way. If we don't witness God in this way, God is deprived of divine might. That's another way to think about it, a slightly more theological way to think about it. A third way I suggest to think about it is that if we don't act in a godly way, God is unable to act in a godly way. This radical interpretation leads me now to the prayer that comes right after the blowing of the shofar, Hayom Harat Olam. And after I read and talk about this a little, you will need your writing implements, and I will give you a few moments to do the assignment that comes at the end. Here is the translation of the prayer. And I would love for somebody else to read this. It says, from this day is the birth of the world. Do I have any takers? It's a beautiful little prayer. It doesn't take long. Anybody?
This day of the world. This day stands all the world's creation up in judgment, stands them as children or as slaves. if as children have compassion for us, as a father has compassion for his children. And if as slaves our eyes raised and fixed on until you show us favor and bring us out of judgment.
And those last two words, awesome and holy. So Rabbi Gordon Tucker has a beautiful teaching that I just received this week about this poem. He says it's almost like we're asking God for a performance review. Now, obviously, performance reviews are very different for children and for slaves, at least hopefully. But he points out that the word harat means birth, but it also has a connotation of judgment, especially in Aramaic, which was the language that was broadly spoken in the time of the rabbis. And olam, as Robert Cohn pointed out earlier, not only means world, but also means eternity. So this means not only, Hayom Harat Olam doesn't only mean that today is the birthday of the world. It also means, as Bob pointed out, that today is pregnant with eternity. And it means that the kinds of judgments we make today can last forever. Today is the day of an eternal judgment. The phrase Harat Olam, as you can see in the highlight that's at the very top of the page now, actually comes from the book of Jeremiah, but Jeremiah used it in a very different way. I'll read this part. Accursed be the man who brought my father the news and said, a boy is born to you, and gave him such joy. Let that man become like the cities which the Lord overthrew without relenting. Let him hear shrieks in the morning and battle shouts at noontime, because he did not kill me before birth. Wow. So that my mother might be my grave, and her womb big with me for all time. Why did I ever issue from the womb? To see misery and woe, to spend all my days in shame. This is incredibly powerful imagery from Jeremiah, who witnessed the destruction of the Second Temple and went into exile in Babylonia. And he uses the phrase Harat Olam to suggest eternal pregnancy. Would that he had never been born, but died with his mother in utero, so that she died and he died too. That, he says, would have been a fate preferable to what he has witnessed and experienced. This is a shocking idea. But now, let's look how this phrase is used by Rabbi Norman Lamb. This is what Rabbi Norman Lamb said in a sermon from 57 years ago tomorrow, the first day of Rosh Hashanah of second day of Rosh Hashanah of 1963. Each of us possesses wonderful narrative abilities and marvelous inner resources. Either we can opt for Jeremiah's Harat Olam, remaining forever with our greatest human treasures locked up within our hearts and never brought to fruition, like a child prodigy for whom a brilliant future is foretold, but who never manages to translate her genius into real achievement. Or we can joyously proclaim, Hayom Harat Olam, that today we shall express those capacities into reality. For today we shall fulfill ourselves by giving birth to a new and fascinating world. I would just want to beseech you all to embark now on that task for the next few remaining minutes that we have together. You're going to make the work of art that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel talks about in terms of what we should remember today, that there's meaning beyond absurdity, that every deed counts, that every word has power, and that you must build your life as a work of art. We're going to take Rabbi Norman Lamb's approach, and here is the assignment that I want you to do. I'm going to give you just a few minutes to do it until my computer says 1:50 p.m. It's 4 minutes from now. It's not long. Here's the assignment, very simple. What is the aspect of yourself that you need to remember in a new way, that you and God can begin to take a new perspective on starting right now? This is private. It won't be shared with anyone, but it is something that I hope that you will refer to regularly throughout the year and look at again on Rosh Hashanah 5782, 1 year from now, and see the transformation that you have wrought because you remembered it. You literally brought it to mind and kept it in your consciousness. What is the thing that you want to frame in a new way in the coming year? Please take the next few minutes to write that down for yourself. Just a few more minutes, moments really. Okay. I will not ask anyone to share in the chat what they have written, but if it helps you to put it out in the world, I invite you to do so. I'll share with you my task for the year. It is to transform a habit of mind that tends toward self-loathing into forgiveness. Because this is a time of year of forgiveness, the ability to be hard on oneself, to think that what one does is never good enough, can be transformed. The work of transformation for me must begin to change feelings of inadequacy or unlovableness through softening toward that sensation, toward that habit of mind. It's really, from a lifetime, a habit of mine. And this is a habit of mine that I'm committed to working against, both with myself and in community. L. Outley says, to allow God to use buffering of contention of others to build a stronger inner character of love and forgiveness in the display of an adversary. Abby says, to be more compassionate and tolerant of others. This is beautiful too, because it helps build community. And having the regular reminder of this work will help build that work. So as you can continue to add into the chat, I want to just give you some closing thoughts. So tomorrow is the second day of Rosh Hashanah, as you know. And on that day, we typically read about the binding of Isaac. This is a story that many modern Jews shy away from because the brutality of a father being willing to sacrifice a son, even if it's for God, seems beyond our modern comprehension. But in some way, shape, or form, all of us can identify, if we think about it, with being Abraham, which is putting everything that we love on the altar of our desire for immortality. And some of us can identify with Isaac, who is born into the world and has things done to him. As people living in the world, born as helpless babies, we have things done for us, and we have things happen to us over which we have no control. This story also must be remembered, and we must go out into the world with the resolution to change ourselves with respect to things that have been done to us, and to change ourselves with respect to the things that we do to others. This is one of the major lessons of the story of Abraham and Isaac, who after all never meet, never interact in the Bible after the binding of Isaac. The story asks us to keep together those two aspects of our persona, to not only soften the way we act toward others, but to change the way we consider the things that have happened to us. This is the deep work that must happen on Rosh Hashanah, that must begin on Rosh Hashanah, that we've approached through our writing exercise today. I'd strongly encourage you to keep the piece of writing that you've created today in a place where you can frequently access it, where you can work gently to consider and transform it, and where you can revisit it 1 year from right now, so that you can see how the work has changed that one thing. Be gentle and kind to yourself. Don't expect too much. Yes, it's true. What I'm asking is for you to take a kind of psychological approach that informs the meaning of this holiday. But like any other work, if you do it consistently for a year and look back at where you started, you will have utterly transformed yourself and your relationship to this one thing. I'd like to dedicate today's study to the memory of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. May her memory be a blessing. And I would like to encourage all of us to work quietly but insistently for change the way she did. And I would like to ask and pray on behalf of all of you for a long life of blessing, like the life Ruth Bader Ginsburg had. And that working gently but insistently for betterment starts with the gentle pushing against barriers that we've begun here today. I wish you Shabbat Shalom and Shana Tova and joy in the work that you'll do. Thank you very much for attending today.